Hi, so this is a longer video, but if you're planning on really taking much note of the data gleaned from all these tests, it's probably important to listen to the preamble, because it does affect how valuable the data may or may not be to you. So strap yourself in, big nerd out on my still testing and knife stills in general. Let's get into it. I see. Who would you say has been your main inspiration for you on this journey?
Satan.
Hi there. Over the past 4 months or so, I've conducted 14 different tests of knife stills, all on the same model of knife. This video is to sort of break down that test itself and also the results, and just a bit of general commentary about how it's all gone. So first of all, I'm just going to go through the minutiae of the test and what it's all about and what my aims were and all that sort of thing. So the aim of these tests was to, by using the same model of knife, eliminating a variable, making a slightly more comparable subset of data amongst all the other edge retention testing that I've done in the past. So the theory is that because all these knives have roughly the same blade shape, thickness, behind the edge thickness, that's a couple of extra controls, I suppose, in the test. So the data here should be a little bit more comparable, not obviously completely comparable though. There are many other variables which I'll go into. What the aim of this general test is to show that there are differences in blade steel, that it does matter what blade steel you have in a knife, but in a more general sense. The aim of this particular set of data is just to show more generalized differences, and it is why I generally use larger, rounder cutoff numbers, because I really don't like people saying, well, this steel cut 6 more times than this steel, so it's better. And I was seeing a bit of that before I sort of ceased that practice. So that's why I'm aiming to show just larger differences or more broad differences. You really can break steels, I think, safely from these tests into categories that are very large. So say great, good, average, bad, ugly, perhaps, is about as specific as I would go using this particular set of data. So the method of my test is to get a knife, to put an edge on it, and to cut twisted sisal rope until the knife no longer cuts a held sheet of printer paper. The reason I chose printer paper is it's easily accessible. Anyone can reproduce this test as long as they get consistent cutting material. Anyone can find printer paper to test their sharpness. It's a basic way of showing and testing sharpness, so it isn't hair whittling, it isn't cutting a piece of phone book paper or anything like that. It's quite basic, so therefore again quite broad. But I feel like it's something that I can achieve, relatively repeatable tests with, that other folks can certainly do at home if they wish. The twisted sisal rope was chosen because it's a natural material, relatively cost effective, and it can be bought in sealed hanks. I buy it in sealed hanks of 10 meters because I do notice when it sits out, when I've previously bought big spools, it does tend to fluff up, and I did wonder if that was changing the consistency. So yeah, using the first front portion of the blade, I'll try and reproduce the same cutting style, and I'll stop periodically, see if the knife is still sharp as per the paper test, and once it's stopped, I assign a number to the knife blade, and that is the score of the knife. So the controls of this, the type of rope that's used, the twisted sisal rope, 10mm, made by the brand Grunt, coming in the 10 meter long sealed hanks. The cutting board has always been the same, just a basic wooden cutting board bought from your big box store. There's nothing special about it. I don't know what wood it is. It's been the same one that's been used the whole time, so it is, showing a few battle scars at this point. The type of cut done, I use a bit of a rolling push cut, as I sort of describe it, so there is some vertical and some horizontal movement of the blade. So I do try and endeavour to use the same portion of the blade of each of the knives, even within these testing or in my larger testing, and I try to use the same amount of blade edge as well. So I try and use about 1.5 to 2 inches of blade over the whole test. The end of my tests, the heel of the blade, like the part closest to like where the handle ends, is still as razor sharp as it was when it begins, and it is just the front sort of 2 inches or so that I've been testing that is now less sharp. So the edge angle and the edge finish is a constant in these tests. These specific tests here, the 14 that I'm talking about, all went to a 17 degree per side mirror polished edge, and by mirror polished I mean you can see text and newsprint in it when you hold the knife up against it. It isn't a true mirror that you would find, reflective from every single angle and completely lustrous. It's not that. It's as good as I can get with my tools, which is a KME angled sharpening system, and also the time and also my skill that I've had to sort of gradually develop, I suppose. And another consistency, fortunately, with this bunch of tests was that they're all using the same knife model. So the Spyderco Mule, it's a small fixed blade knife from Spyderco designed for this exact application. I think more internally, or for the super fans to mess about with different steels. Of course, I am, I suppose, a bit of a steel super fan, so the perfect platform for this little thing to happen. So the intended test variable was the blade steel. The idea was to show the variation between using different blade steels to do the same test and showing how long their edges lasted versus each other. So the variables that I can't meet or that I can't rule out or stomp out of this test are the Rockwell hardness, and this is an important one. Rockwell hardness has undoubtedly a large role in how long or how short a knife holds its edge, how well it resists rust. It's how the knife is formed from a sort of a more raw steel product into an actual blade. It's what makes it a hard usable knife blade. And the Rockwell hardness, or just the heat treat in general, there's other ways of measuring heat treatment as well, and hardness of blades indeed. But yeah, there's not something I could shop within. There isn't really a consistent single number on any scale really that you can buy every sort of blade steel in. Some lower end steels simply won't get to, say, even if you look at a relatively achievable number, usually like 60, some lower end steels won't even be able to get to 60, and some higher end steels really aren't encouraged to bring below, say, 62. So it's very rare that you're going to find a single number that a company is going to make or produce a series of knives in. The only thing I could think of to do this would be spending huge amounts of money and getting a single maker to make the same model of knife again and really try and bring up or bring down its heat treatments. Then you'd have truly comparable data in terms of its heat treatment or hardness, so to speak. So that's not something I could particularly meet or stamp out, the Rockwell hardness, and it's probably one of the biggest things to take into account, and one of the biggest reasons why I say please don't form your whole opinion of a steel from these tests, because there are ways to make lower complexity steels perform exceptionally better with different heat treatments and things. The Spyderco Mules, whilst all the same pattern, do have some small differences in them when you hold them all in a line. Some, they aren't all a identical water jet cut of each other. Some even seem slightly thicker. The K390 one and the Cruer one indeed seem a little bit thicker than the other ones, only by a small amount, but there are still, you can't ignore that. It's still some minute differences, and even some sort of what I would say is getting towards larger differences especially given those extra thicknesses, probably does translate as some difference behind the edge as well. You have to, of course, consider that twisted sisal is a natural material, and one strand may have a different sort of microstructure than another strand. Perhaps the way that it's processed makes sort of harder, more rough parts of it, given that it is not a completely identical polymer or anything like that. It's a natural material, and again, just the reasons why I sort of say this isn't everything. There are things that could be happening that I'm not aware of, butterfly effect type stuff. The edge finish is an interesting one to think of. These are all the same edge finish. They go to the 0.1 micron DMT type strop from the KME. However, I know for a fact that some steels perform better with a bit more of a rough finish. I've sort of shown that before, as much as I can show anything. I've shown that some steels like M4 seem to perform a little bit better if left a little bit more rough than a mirror polish. So I had to sort of pick to control something and then introduce sort of say a bit of a what if variable in another sense, and I just went with the same edge finish because then at least I can say it was uniform across the board. But yes, another reason why that this might not show the best performance out of each of these steels, because some may simply go better with a rougher edge, and a mirror polish may not be for every steel. I did choose mirror polish because it generally does get a good to great performance from basically all steels that it's used on. It just may not get the optimal performance. Another thing to acknowledge is that I use an angle finding app for my phone, which does seem to be relatively consistent, and I've tested it against some other sort of more sophisticated ones, and it's about 1 degree plus or minus seemingly, but then again it's just a piece of third-party tech. I do the same for everyone, so I guess even if the angle is actually turning out to be 16.5 or 18 or something, it's using the same app all through, so I guess that does make another constant, but again, it's just a bit of tech that I'm not really sure of the origins of. It's the best I could do. I'm just a guy. Another thing is the obvious massive human element here. I just use my completely fallible human arm, which of course means throughout a test I could fatigue and start perhaps pushing downwards harder, and then which could result in some micro twisting against the board, which could damage the edge in other ways apart from the intended form of damage, which is being pushed through sisal rope. So you just need to consider what a person is capable of, which is relatively close broad repetition, but in terms of minutia, certainly not. So just another thing to take into account there. The thickness behind the edge of the knives, as far as I can tell, it's all about 20,000th, but it's again, I'm not an expert in measuring these things. I've whacked the calipers on these mules and they all show about the same, but then this is just me. I'm not all I'm saying, I guess, for most of these type of human ones is that I'm not an expert in any of these things. Not a knife maker, not a metallurgist or anything like that. I'm just the guy at my house trying to do a pretty rough backyard experiment. The sharpness is, of course, a decent sized what if type question, because whilst I'm happy that they all glide through the paper when I start, they may be microscopically sharper, of course. Like some steels, and I do notice this, some steels get sharper than other steels. They just seem to hold those few molecules at the edge a little bit better than others, perhaps. It's and whether those fall off in the first cut, I'm not sure. But just another thing, remember my test of sharpness is just gliding easily through a piece of paper, so take that for what it is. And yeah, another thing is, of course, I generally stop, I usually get through the first 100 or so in terms of rope cuts before I even stop to test, and then I'll just generally go through 50s, and the largest amount is often 25s. And that's a completely intentional thing that I've brought into it, because I was seeing people saying, VG10 cut 6 less than 14C28N, therefore VG10 sucks and 14C28N is better. I didn't like that. I didn't like where that was going, so I just want to show broader differences rather than exact differences. I guess harkening back to how I've started all these tests, I have learned a lot and changed a lot of my own opinions as well. It's been a real process for me over the last couple of years. So say my original test, D2 versus AUS8, I'm still quite happy with that, but then when I start testing the more similar steels, I perhaps was erroneous in saying that one was better than the other. If I indeed did, I'm not sure, but yeah, take it for what it is. I'm just generally trying to show larger, more obvious differences. So those are my variables that I can think of. Of course, there may be some other ones. I have no ego about these tests at all. I really don't. I mean, I'm happy with them, and I'm somewhat proud of this body of work, but as with all sort of sciences, even the bro sciences, the backyard idiot sciences, completely open to someone getting a completely different set of results and discussing why and what's different and what mistakes I've made or whatever. So again, I just really wanted to go over everything that I could think of, just because it's I sort of often see these numbers get probably used for a bit too much, a bit too fiercely, in terms of saying that one steel is objectively better. All I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of variables that can be changed, used, or applied, both in production of knives and in testing of knives, to get better performances out of steels that in this test may have done worse or better than other steels. So the benefits and the challenges of these tests. So the benefits, of course, I'm an interested person, like I have interest in steel, and I've always wanted to know that, basically that these expensive steels are worth it, or in terms of in terms of how much money you're happy to spend is completely objective, but there is a difference. Was all I really tried to set out back when I tested D2 versus AOSA, that it wasn't just marketing guff, that the steels that are known for edge retention are likely going to perform better than the steels that aren't known for edge retention. So it's got a good general vibe of showing incremental improvements, perhaps for increasing steel complexity, if you're using a generalized sort of decent heat treatment. So it's good. I'm glad it satisfies my interest in it. I think it does show that, so that's been a benefit for sure. I mean, it's been another good thing is it's been good entertainment for everyone. It's been something that a lot of people have, I noticed, started doing their own tests about, and this is just from my larger testing, not just from these tests, which is really good to see. I'm really happy to see that people are trying it against, there's other rope guys, there's people trying it against cardboard, all that sort of stuff, just this air of curiosity, which can only be good for the community as a whole, in terms of people, taking these knives, actually using them, and testing these things that companies are putting on knives and charging us an extra $100 for sometimes. It's nice to know that if you actually get the Spyderco that's $100 more, so you get the Paramilitary 2 that's in Maximet that's $100 more than the S30V one, you're actually going to get extra performance. So it keeps companies aware that we are going to look into these things, which is great. The benefits of this specific set of tests is that they are a little bit more comparable, given that I've removed some variables relating to the knife design and the thickness and whatnot. Even though there are still some smaller variations between the mules, I'm happy that it's ruled out a few extras. So these are somewhat more comparable numbers, taking into account those other variables I've spoken about already. The challenges of these tests was the main one I found. The main reason that I didn't just go through all of them one after another is that I'm still a YouTuber, I'm still a content creator, and as douchey as a term as that often is, I do want my videos to be somewhat entertaining as well. There are some out there of you who just want to see the raw numbers, and that's fine. Some of you hate my intros, some of you cringe whenever I do something odd, but to me that's been a real big part of it, is trying to keep these a little bit interesting, entertaining, whether it's just having a really silly little intro or like throwing up some gags in between, towards the end of it, where I do some pretty out there stuff before the video starts. That's always going to be a part of this channel, and if you don't like it, then you're probably pretty safe to just drag that little slider a minute in and then start with the real stuff, and that's totally cool as well. But that has been a challenge, keeping that sort of that dynamism going, and it's often taken a week or so before I get another good idea for an intro. So there you go. And probably the biggest challenge here was fatigue. In terms of doing the same thing over and over again, it's funny, as this massively stimulates my intellectual side of my knife interest, but it was quite stifling from a creative standpoint. The knife intros helped, the Knife Lab intros do help a little bit, but yeah, in terms of just, you do have this thing where you start seeing it as a job that needs to be done. I've always really resisted that on YouTube. It's why I very rarely take people's loaner knives, very rarely take people sponsorships, because once I've got something there that I feel like I need to get through, it makes it significantly less fun. So I did struggle with that throughout on the whole. So, full disclosure, that's something that definitely did go on. And then fatigue, in terms of physical fatigue, my shoulder joint became significantly weaker. My arm strength and my hand strength is huge compared to this hand. It's noticeable. It's a really funny thing, like a really odd transformation to for your body to undertake for such a silly, well, not a silly reason, but such a random reason. But yeah, in terms of my actual shoulder, it's definitely why this has been backing off slowly as well as the creative issues. I used to be able to do 3 of these tests a day, and I just need to stop for a good 6 months to a year probably to actually get my shoulder reset, get all the cartilages and stuff settled back down, and any inflammation that's happening in there to stop. Because doing anything over and over again, we know that term, don't we? RSI. So I've been sort of battling with that just a little bit. There's no permanent damage done. You don't have to worry about that or anything like that, but it is something that I'm aware of perhaps being a possibility in the future. So I'm definitely, this will be it for a little while. Apart from some inside review tests, which I'll always do just as a part of the test of the knife. But in terms of seeking out stills, this will be largely wrapping up. Just I'd feel so silly if I couldn't pick up my kids or something in a year's time because I did one too many knife labs. So there's that too. But anyway, let's get on to the results. But first of all, you may say, I don't think you've uploaded 14 tests. I'm going to show you the last 3 now. So let me reveal to you the results for PSF 27, crew wear, and to finish off, quite appropriately, Maximet mules. Let's get into it. So the results. Having done those 3 tests, I'll slide them into where they fit. Sorry. So that being said, remembering some steels don't perform to their optimum with the polished edge that I'm giving them. It was just a standardized edge that I chose. So that being said, some of these results may be different if I did all these under different conditions, for sure. And of course highlighting the variables that I couldn't control from earlier in the video that I pointed out. But without further ado, let's talk about the results, and I'll speak a bit individually about each steel. So the first steel, the lowest result, was B75P. A steel that I had no knowledge of before. Looking at the ingredients, it's a relatively standard recipe compared to most modern sort of powder type steels. And it's certainly a good steel, no problems at all. I wouldn't say that any of these are bad or even average steels. These were all good steels. Some of them are prioritizing different effects, of course, and B75P, I was contacted by a maker. He says it's just a good, affordable steel, machinable, gets some good results, so for sure, no worries at all. If you're just after something general use, good, no worries. And you're after a carpenter steel and you're after something with a bit of a different name perhaps, then B75P would definitely be the ticket. I would not have a problem owning a knife in that steel. Next is LC200N. LC200N is a steel that obviously prioritizes rust resistance rather than edge retention, but the good edge retention of it is what makes it a very popular steel nowadays, because it does in fact get consistently decent, both anecdotal and in test results for its edge retention, even though it isn't the primary focus of the steel. So while it's one of the lower results here, you look at the whole picture of the steel, and it's still one of my favorites. 52-100, it's similar case. This is a steel for other, you buy it for other reasons apart from sheer edge retention, of course. 52-100 is a favorite of the custom knife makers. Quite a variable treatment. People were surprised that it didn't do higher, but I look at the ingredients, the makeup, and the Rockwell that it was at. It seemed to be about fine, par for the course. I would say that yes, a bit like W2 the other day, a custom maker I'm sure could grind and treat this to a point where it would cut for a lot longer. These pure carbon steels have a lot of flexibility in them for sort of getting them nice and hard. You can get them hard and glassy and really great with edge retention, or you can get them soft and gummy and great for prying and levering and that sort of stuff. So it really is up to the treater there, I think. Crewware was the next one, clocking in at 400 cuts, and that's totally fine for crewware. It's got a bit of tungsten and a bit less, or about half the chromium of, say, your S30V type steels, but the carbon and the vanadium are about half the course for the your other standard sort of good pocket knife steels, except this one's a tool steel because it is not stainless, I suppose. Crewware has been treated to a range of effects, and it can get better than this, it can be worse than this in terms of its edge retention, but I'm pretty happy with this one. I'd be happy to have a knife in crewware steel, as long as I remember to heat treat it. No, not heat treat it. Rust treat it periodically. B70P, another exotic steel that I hadn't really heard of before. Whether it makes it exotic or not, I don't know. That cut 450 times through the rope. This is very similar steel to the 75P. It has a bit of a niobium in it though, so it's niobium's a bit of a different, forms different kinds of carbides, quite hard ones I'm told, fine hard carbides, so maybe that did the trick. Maybe it's a bit higher on the Rockwell scale, maybe just the butterfly effect of the testing made it cut better than its sort of sister steel, the B75P, so there you go. But B70P got a good result for sure. PSF27 in this test, the one that I just did, cut 450 times. This was less than I thought it would do, but then I've long since learnt not to go in expecting anything from a steel because they often prove you wrong. I've done this on a Gale Bradley, what's the Junction from Spyderco, it cut 550 times with the same edge. So this would be down to heat treatment or just the uncontrolled variables of the test, I would say. Still very happy to suggest that PSF27 is perhaps still the optimal form of D2 steel. It is a spray-formed D2 mod recipe, so pretty good general use fixed blade steel, as long as, again, you've got to be a little bit aware of its tarnishing capacity, I guess. It doesn't have a huge amount of carbon or chromium in it to not be tied up with carbon to be left behind for stain resistance. So, something to keep in mind, but it's a great steel. LMAX cut 475 times, was not surprised. LMAX seems in most ways to be sort of a cut above, just a small cut above, but a cut above like your S35 VNs, like your basic entry level powdered stainless pocket knife steels. LMAX also is used to good effect in fixed blades, another sort of good custom maker steel. You see it used in sort of your smaller fixed blade shops a fair bit. Bark River uses it, it's pretty good effect. Zero Tolerance used it for a while. Absolutely fine steel, great result, good stainlessness, good mix of all the properties, I would say. If you want to spend a little bit more and get something that's a little bit better at everything again, you could go up to M390, but LMAX is certainly wonderful. The next steel really surprised me. This is probably the shocker of the test. The RWL34 cut 475 times as well, the same as LMAX. So whether that's just a freak anomaly in the testing, or whether this RWL was treated best, or whether it is true that RWL34 is such a fine grained, powdered steel, given that it's CPM 154 or 154 CM, like a variant made by made by Damasteel. Perhaps perhaps it's optimized for this mirror polished edge that I'm doing. Maybe the case, but at any rate, it was a great performance from RWL34. Definitely not one to be shunned. Moving on to the kind of higher achieving in terms of edge retention, PD1 was next. This is like a micro melt version of Crewware that I would assume has a slightly different heat treat in this roll as well, because it cut a fair bit more than the Crewware did. That being said, remembering back to that Crewware, the knife that I tested earlier in this video, that had there was an issue with the heat treat. I read about it. Someone told me about this in the mules. So if you've got a Crewware mule with an underline underneath where it says Crewware, apparently that one was reheat treated again, so that may further complicate things. Anyway, back to PD1. PD1 did really well, just a great edge retaining steel. Again, it's a tool steel, so you'd have to protect it a little bit more than your stainless steels, but if you see a knife in it, which I don't see too many knives in PD1, but if you see a knife in it, buy with confidence, for sure. At least seems great. Seems like it's got good potential. M4 was next. Quite predictably, M4 cut a lot better than most of the other steels. M4 cut 620 times through the rope, so M4 is much more sort of edge retention beast. It'll rust a lot quicker, but it really is geared towards cutting well. And I was happy with this performance because my theory is, and I've almost satisfied it for myself, probably not for everyone else, but my theory is that M4 cuts best with a slightly rougher edge. So for it to do that with a polished edge, I was really happy with the results from M4. S90V was next. Again, not particularly surprisingly, it was in the upper echelon of these edge-retaining steels. S90V is a vanadium beast. It does really, really well. Most people have the same anecdote about it. Cuts for ages, takes a while to sharpen. Mine was similar. It was one of the longer. In fact, the next 4 steels definitely had a slightly higher level of sharpening duration needed. It wasn't harder, just because my system is the system it is. It just had to go for longer. But anyway, 700 times on the S90V. Great job. I was really happy with the S90V treatment. That's about as much as you'd want. And again, that is so much EDC use before you're even slightly dull. So 700 cuts of sisal rope, that's a lot of envelopes, you know? And so if you're getting like a Benchmade 941 in S90V or something like that, that's going to probably have maybe a less sort of optimized heat treat or whatever, but it's still going to do great. So A11 was a steel that I hadn't really heard of before. A11 did very well. It cut 875 times, and yeah, it was sort of up there with K390. It's a similar kind of steel, similar specs, similar like idea behind it, I guess, behind putting it into a knife. So 875 was an excellent result, and it's it was definitely, well, it still is in the top 3. So segueing that into the next entry, which was K390. So spoilers for number 1, which were probably not spoilers at all, probably expected, but K390 cut 940 times. Easily the best result I've had on K390 before. And again, I was surprised because I think K390 would also do best, a bit like M4, with a more coarse finish, but with its mirror polish finish, it just did exceptionally well. So K390, again, I've got my Police 4 in my pocket here. This would be a slightly softer version of it. Again, I think these are about 62 or something. I believe the K390 mils is at 64 or something like that, I think. But even now, I'm looking at this Police I've had for a couple of days, and it is tarnished just a little bit. Not ugly, but it shows the use on the blade. So just something you need to take into account when you get into these super edge retention focused steels, that you start sacrificing things like rust resistance generally. And last of all, yes, the Maximet mule cut the most. It cut 1075, so 1075 times. To be honest, I was actually thinking it would go a little bit higher, being that anecdotally from the Spyderco forums, this seems like it's treated just a little bit higher than the standard Maximet on their pocket knives that Spyderco are doing, which is, I believe, it's 66 or 67. Apparently the mule is at 68 or 69, but again, I can't verify any of that, so maybe it isn't, or maybe it's just the rest of the variables again rearing their heads. But Maximet was easily, by about 135 cuts, the winner of this whole thing. And that's, again, not surprising, sort of confirmation, I guess, of what we all suspect about Maximet, that it is definitely one of the heavy hitters. Conclusions I draw from this. So, as I said at the start, my conclusions are I try and be a bit broader than perhaps I used to be, and perhaps folks like me to be, but I think it generally just shows there's definite pattern that these ultra high-end steels that are made and sold for edge retention, there does seem to be something there. So with relatively, as controllable as I can, you really do get a boost from, say, your M4 and upwards, those steels that will rust a little bit. Standout steels, I would say, Maximet obviously. S90V, thinking about it, it's a stainless steel and it won't rust particularly easily as well. And it's still cutting, up there with the crazy high stuff. So that's pretty impressive stuff. The RWL34 result I was really happy with. The Crew Rare is one that I'm not sure about. Just given that underline and that little bit of extra couple of questions about it. But it's still definitely a sound result. So yeah. I guess the best thing about this is it's just been some slightly more comparable numbers, and whether or not you take these tests to the bank at all, whether you put any stock at them, it's totally up to you. I leave this with you entirely. Again, I've got no ego in this. If you don't want to if you think I'm wasting my time in my life, then you're completely welcome to. And you know what? As someone who is doing something that's roughly scientific, I know that's a large part of this as well. People just saying, no, I don't buy that at all. So that's fine too. But yeah, I am quite happy that I seem to be at least satisfying myself that when I have sought these other stills and when I've used these other stills and I've thought to myself, gee, this one really does seem to be lasting a fair bit longer than the others. I'm happy that that does seem to actually be a verifiable thing. So that's the testing so far. Thank you all very much, and I guess I'll wrap this up with the acknowledgements. I'll try not to forget anyone. The biggest acknowledgement I need to give are to Dave and to Daniel. So they are the ones that own all these mules that have sent me. Dave sent me a big box of mules, and that was a bit of an ordeal getting them here. My customs decided that I might be a knife dealer from importing so many knives, and they wanted me to do a couple of extra claims and a little bit of stress there. I was very, very worried about this package of mules not getting here, and that whole process was very sobering, and so I am very reluctant to do like the loaning and sending back as much because of that. Dave is obviously, we've dealt with each other a lot, so it wasn't particularly stressful, but that was something. So thank you very much, Dave. He also does all the spreadsheeting as well, so he's obviously a numbers man, more of a numbers man even than myself. But if you enjoy these videos, you owe a lot to Dave. So he's David R in the comments that he'll show up down below sometimes. So very much to Dave, and Daniel, of course, sending his M4 and S90V mules as well. So very, very cool. Nick Shabazz, Nick organised for me to have this KME system, and these tests would not have happened without the KME system. I don't have the skill nor the time to learn the skill to freehand sharpen to a degree, and what these tests needed was a degree. So I do get told a lot of people, oh, give up on that wussy fixed angle sharpening system. I know the real men use the stones, all that, whatever you want to. If you want to put stock in that sort of thing, then that's fine, but all I'm saying is for these tests, this was the best way to do it. It's the most precise I can get. So Nick, and also the Instagram and knife guy, he has helped me out with he rushed over some more films that I needed when I was doing the heat of this testing, so that was very cool as well. So yeah, some epic thanks to those guys. My Patreons, of course, paying for all this rope. I would estimate I've probably spent about $500 or $600 worth of just rope doing all these tests, as well as my reviews and stuff too in the last few months. So it is a definite expense. So thank you all to the Patreons. Whether you're a new Patreon, whether you've just chucked in $1, whether you were a Patreon and you stopped for whatever reason, I always say with the patrons, if you want to stop, please don't ever feel like I'm cursing the list of people who are not patrons anymore. It's amazing that you even did it for a month, so I really do appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who buys the shirts. I've sold a few of these shirts, thanks to Misheard Knife Reviews. All the money that I spend, it all goes back into the channel, it really does. It's not I'm not spending it on my car. I'm not even really spending it on vanity knives that I'm just going to not review and just have for fun. Everything that I do spend on from Patreon is just, it's going to end up being tested, going to end up being used roughly for the channel, so it does really help. The YouTube AdSense revenue is sporadic, it does okay. So between that and the Patreon, I'm able to do this a lot more than I would if I was just using my wage. We're saving for some other things at the moment personally, so it's basically the only income this channel has at the moment. So these things just cost money, it's just how they are, and I'm not wealthy enough from my job to be able to just do it off my own back. So as it grew, I've been able to do more and more, and if it's all stopped, then I would keep doing it, I would just scale it back massively. So that's about it as well. But yes, thank you all my Patrons. Just a bit of a side monologue about money, not probably welcome, but there's that too. And just also thanks to everyone who makes like a constructive comment, or makes a comment that's like just saying thanks. Like I do read all the comments. It would take me 3 hours a day to respond to every comment, so I'm sorry about that. I do try. I try and just give a heart where I can and all that sort of stuff. I read it all though, so I think every YouTuber does read all the comments. It's just wading into them can be massive. So trust me, if you send a little message of good job or whatever, it has been read and it has been appreciated. And I do remember all the names of the frequent commenters, and unfortunately I remember the names of the dicks as well, but luckily they seem to be getting less and less, and I do feel like that's a bit of a part of me perhaps being a bit more open about the faults in the testing. I think that's probably something I did need to do a bit more from the start. from when I started about a year ago to really sort of acknowledge the variables rather than just kind of doing the tests and presenting them, I think that did satisfy an element of people that just felt like they were stamping up and down saying, but these tests aren't science. And of course, they're not pure science. Of course they're not. There's a guy in his house trying to show some things, and that's the best way to look at it. So, that being said, it's been a really positive experience. I do need a rest now. I'm doing a couple of little edge tests upcoming. So there's a knife that I'm testing for someone. There's a couple of other little things that are coming up for the channel, which, so by all means, the knife lab's not over by any sense at all. But yeah, just the pure edge testing and me seeking out knives on my own is going to have a bit of a rest because, as I said, this is getting a little bit sore. But apart from that, I hope you've enjoyed the data, I hope you've enjoyed the intros, I hope you've enjoyed everything. Stay tuned, there'll be still heaps of videos coming out, so just a little bookend on this little season, I guess you could call it, of mule testing. Thank you all everyone, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.
Patreon roll call. Griff, Brad G, NS Family, Von Banks, Mao, Jason Clark, Lawrence Medina, Patrick Penner, Nathan, Spellman, Mike, Liam Wesson, Chris Hauler, William M. Kinsley, Morton, Ard Apple, Carl Miller, Michael Moore, Eric Paisham, Oysin O'Brien, Daniel Casement, Greg Malcolm, Antec7, Zach Brubs, Jason Leonard, Zerber, Joshua Goldstein, Richard Noggin, Valerie Harsonsky, Stian Larson, Brandon Montgomery, Brian M, Simon Bruce, Oscar Medina, Advanced Knife Bro, Bjorn O, Rudy Panzergrau, Charles Anderson, Fraser Hood, Troy McKee, Drew Estes, Charlie Pettinger, David Richardson, Ryan Holzer, Birdshot 4, Tony Smith, Jeffrey Kine, Gabe Vigil, Andy Park, Nelson Moo, Kurt Williams, Bruce J. Mack, Patreon John, Rick Telsrow, Brendan Bell, Ryan Roper, Jason Clark, Florian Schoenbach, Frank Zhang, Paul, Matthew Baker, Joseph Cusa, Colin Herrero, Nicholas Olesic, Robert Chibula, Travis Reed, David Axman, Brett Lindley, Alan Edward Chapman, Dante, Mickey Kime, Ismail, Norden, Carl Watts, Michael Reed, Paul Bell, Tommy Bravo, Suggestion Boy, Lucanos, Tyrion, Brett T, Francesco Curcherello, Michael P. Shustak, Andrew at 555 Gear, Michael Cole, Brad Puicius, Sam Alpert, Nathan Van Arkel, Priest, Ryan Houston, Luigi Di Francesco, Christian Corbin Christensen even, haha, sorry mate, Dan Swaney, Prairie, Heifer, German Survivalist, Matthias Girth, Lisa Stevens, Bilbo Baggins, Wayne Abramson, Jan Van Alien, Aaron R. Cameron, Daniel O'Hara, Brandon Chase, Pierre Monson, Stephen Robertson, Sean Gandy, Bruno Fleur, Ryan Frank, Vinny Nero, Laura Sachs, Jim Hamilton, The Sportsman's Guide, thank you guys, Ed Connery, Regular George, Timothy Thomas, Buck Nien, The Chug Dude, Florian, Gary Creeley, and JB Morris.